Alrighty. Today, well, let me back up. Yesterday, the previous video, I guess video number 3, at the very end, what I did is I started making up pejorative statements with respect to Ocasio Crazy Cortex, the squad, and a low IQ, and these people don't know what they're doing, and so on. Well, this afternoon I had a conversation with a woman over at the King Supers here in Castle Rock. She was walking by with a mask on. And, of course, wearing masks don't do anything to prevent the spread of viral bacterial infection. The numbers are kind of sketchy, and I'm sort of fuzzy on the numbers. You can look them up very easily. But between 1900 and 1977, which I think was the last known death from smallpox, between 300 and 500 million people died. That was a pandemic. It was a horrible disease. We were able to eradicate it. I mean, people didn't walk around with masks on because it doesn't work. Now, admittedly, most of those deaths were in the third world, but a lot of them weren't. It was a pandemic, and it had been around since the dawn of time until they figured out how to get rid of it. Anyway, so that leads me to today's topic, which happens to be logical fallacies. The number of people out there that make arguments. For example, I discount Ocasio Crazy Cortex because she's low IQ. These people are uneducated. The whole squad are uneducated. I mean, you know, I don't want to be mean, but and I'm gonna go into it a little more further. But you know, IQ matters. IQ is the ability to be able to recognize patterns within context. I have a friend of mine, the Band of Life music that I put at the bumper on my music, and the man's a musical god. His ability to be able, he can hear a song one time and play it note for note absolutely perfect. So his musical IQ is off the charts. I mean, he just is, it's like the Do. The Do can sit down, hear a song one time, and then you can improvise on it, play it note for note. The guy's got not just the knack, but there's some ineffable quality that these people have, the creators, musicians, and artisans, and so on have, that the rest of us don't. Now, if everybody had that skill set, then it wouldn't be special. The idea of equity, diversity, inclusion is nonsense, absolute nonsense. Everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. We leverage our strengths and we work on our weaknesses, and we do the best we can with what we've got. All right, so Jordan Peterson, and I'm sure most of the people who watch me would know Jordan Peterson, explains the Gaussian curve. It's the bell curve, and it's a disturbing fact is that from an IQ of 85 to 115 makes up 66.7% of society throughout the world in the general aggregate. In general aggregate. All right, so 85 is the IQ at which the United States military will not recruit you because there's no job that you can be trained to do where you're not actually counterproductive to the mission. All right, so 85 in a high-tech society dealing with computers and higher math and engineering and especially the complexity that you'll find in the military, because their mission is far removed from civilian world. I'm ex-Army myself, 78 to 84, and the equipment that you have to work on, missile systems and unique vehicles and so on that you would never find in a civilian world, you have to have, in this case, let's say, a mechanical aptitude, a mechanical IQ, capable of being able to be trained in AIT to be able to do the job for the 2, 4, 6 years or lifetime that you spend in the military. And so you've got 85 to 115 IQ takes up 2/3 of society. All right, everything of course this is backwards because I'm looking at the camera, but everything to the right, which would be to your left, everything to the right, right, on the bell curve is everything above 115, which they presume is a high IQ level. And of course, admittedly, IQ is within context. Some people who are not so great numeracy, numbers, very well may have the aptitude to be able to learn languages very, very rapidly because their language skill IQ is extremely high. Once again, IQ is the ability to be able to recognize patterns within context. With that in mind, riddle me this, Batman. All right, so there you go. So, these are going to be these IQ test questions are going to become progressively more difficult. All right. Now let's to the left-hand side of the bell curve are those persons that lack the ability to be able to learn so that they're not counterproductive to the mission of the military. Well, sadly, of course, for dementia and Down syndrome and several other reasons, in a high-tech society, the West, as you might call it, if you're just a rice paddy farmer in China, you're a hunter-gatherer in Africa or something. In those societies where it's not a high-tech society, you can do just fine. But when you start to move towards those societies that are very complicated, if you don't have an IQ of at least 85, you have what we would say in law, we call it diminished capacity. Through dementia, Down syndrome, or you simply you weren't born with a high enough IQ. I like to think it's because of lack of folic acid in the mother's diet while she's gestating the baby. I don't think it really has much, if anything, to do with actual race, but it's certainly a genetic component with respect to IQ. So when we go to Islam, for example, the average IQ in Islam is 81. I mean, admittedly, you have to be pretty gullible. That's not really a stupid issue, but you've got to be gullible to believe in any religion. I happen to be an atheist. I was raised Jewish on my mom's side, Southern Baptist on my father's side, and I became an atheist at the age of 30 after I got enough education to be able to realize that it's nothing more than a control mechanism to be able to control society. It's much cheaper to scare the masses into hope or fear, hope of heaven and reward, right, virgins or whatever, and then fear of death. It's a bifurcation that the primary motivators of man, and then so it's much cheaper to have, in a historical sense, history of religion is used to be able to control the masses, and it's cheaper to do that than it is to feed an army and pay them to be able to go out at the point of the sword to be able to control the masses. So they control the masses through religion. Anyway, so my notes. So I need people to understand that when they watch these videos that I'm always mindful of something called Dunning-Kruger. Dunning-Kruger was a study that shows that without exception, that includes me and everybody else, is that it's impossible for an individual to be able to gauge their own competency or incompetency within a field of study, right? And what they find is that those persons who are the most competent in a field of study actually rank themselves below their actual competency. They're always very cautious about ranking their own competency in a field that they're actually pretty competent in. And the reverse is true. Those persons who are the most incompetent within a field of study seem to overestimate their competency. So what that moves towards is what's called the four classical states of knowing. It says you don't know, you don't know, you know you don't know, you think you, so you know you don't know, you know, how do I not remember this? I've had this conversation a million times. You know, you don't know, you don't know, you know you don't know, you know, there we go, and you know but you can't explain it, right? In other words, I can teach you the mechanics on how to ride a bicycle, but I can't teach you how to ride a bicycle. It's something ineffable about the ability to, the balancing, is learning how to play a piano. The mechanics of, or in martial arts, it's the same thing. I can give you the mechanics on how to do it, but there's no way to be able to actually, it's that expression that comes out of muscle memory. It comes out of muscle memory. And it's just hours and hours, days and days, years and years of practice, 10 years to become marginally proficient on the piano, for example. I don't know how much it is for a violin and all of these other instruments and all these other skill sets that people learn. And so they can teach them the mechanics and how to do it, but it's just through muscle memory and practice that you actually get to where, in martial arts, we call it sen sen no sen, doing without thinking. All right, it's you just, that reflex takes over and you're able to do it. All right, so so four states of knowing, an IQ, Jordan Peterson's IQ, and then this also moves towards the ability to be able to learn. There's and once again, all of this is in context. This is neurolinguistic programming shows us that there are three primary ways in which people learn. There's the audible, the visual, and the kinesthetic. Right, so I'm a visual, for example. I can sit down and read an entire hornbook law book over a weekend and just memorize. But yet, if you put me into the carousel in a class where you're just listening to some professor, Professor Strang or somebody, sitting there using the chalk on the chalkboard, I just go right to sleep. I'm just not an audible learner. Although I am very verbal, I'm much more of a kinesthetic, hands-on learner kind of a person. And then, because I'm a ballroom dancer, martial arts, all of these other things, these are very kinesthetic ways to learn. Whereas I just can't just sit and listen to somebody in a classroom all day. It drives me. Just give me the book. I'll memorize the book. I'll take the test. I'll ace it. Thank you very much, and I'll move on to the next subject. And so once again, the way I frame my arguments and the way I look at things are with Dunning-Kruger in mind, states of knowing, the constraints in society. It says these aren't random, they're not arbitrary, they're not capricious. All right, so I've got to go through these. Oh, all right. Every time I like to think that I'm smart, which is often, I like to put myself in check by watching some of the British, what they refer to them as panel shows. We would call them quiz shows, but they call them panel shows. There's several out there that I really suggest that you people go check out. One of them is called QI. It was originally hosted by Stephen Fry. QI as in quite interesting, and it's the opposite of IQ, right? It's a quiz show, but it's a panel show too. If you watch these, you'll see what I mean. So the purpose of this show is they ask you a question that you think you know the answer to, and they use what are called double bluffs. Sometimes they'll actually ask you a question that what you think the answer to is, it really is the answer, and oftentimes they're not. So the example I give people about this is in one of the first episodes, they asked, how many moons does the Earth have? Now, the double bluff on that would be, the answer would be 1, and everybody goes, well, the moon, there's only 1. Well, of course, that was certainly one of the classics is that at that time, they had just recently discovered another moon with a periodicity of 1,000 years or something around the Earth called Crowenia. And of course, so everybody answered 1, the klaxon goes off, and of course they lose points and so on. So if you want to see a quiz show that has some real merit to it, you want to go look at QI. There's several of them that I watched that you want to go see. One is called Countdown. There's Rachel Riley, Susie Dent, and Jimmy Carr. Jimmy Carr is a very rude comedian. He's very good. Susie Dent is where I got the word ochlocracy from the other day. She has a Twitter feed where she gives all these archaic words, and it really expands your vocabulary. And then there's Rachel Riley, before the baby, was screaming hot. Now, of course, she's had the second kid. She's still nursing, and she's carrying a pregnancy weight. But if you watch the older episodes, she's very attractive. But what's interesting about Countdown is it's numbers and word game. Now, the word it's anagrams. You're calculating, you're figuring out anagrams. And then what they do is they put up random numbers out of a stack, and then they have a target number comes up. And the idea is to multiply, add, subtract, and divide the numbers. You only use each one number once, but you don't have to use all the numbers that are listed to try to reach that target number. Now, I get maybe 80 to 90% of those right. A lot of them are, sadly, the targets are random, and sometimes they're ridiculously easy. But of the ones that are difficult, I still get like 80 to 90% of them. But then Rachel Riley, she's got I think it's a master's. It could be just her bachelor's in mathematics from Oxford University, and she is top of the food chain smart, and she figures out these like crazy solutions to be able to solve these target numbers for this TV show called Countdown that you can just look it up on YouTube. Just put in Countdown. And then there's a comedy version of this show. It's called 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown. And once again, it's the same people, but then they bring in some comedians, and so they're doing their comedian shtick while they're actually playing the game. It's a very unique. It's called 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown. Then there's Victoria Corin Mitchell, who I also think is extremely attractive because she's extremely smart. She does a TV show called Only Connect, and that one's kind of hard to explain. But if you want to really feel stupid, go watch Only Connect. And then the one that really nails it, it's called University Challenge. If you watch University Challenge, it makes Jeopardy look as though it was written for 3-year-olds. I mean, if you were to take the best and the brightest of the 5 universities, let's say Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Brown, and Stanford, right? And you were to take the best and brightest out of each one person out of each one of those, they could not field a team that would even remotely compete against these kids that are on a University Challenge. If you want to see a hard game show, and in my case, I watch it because I love to feel stupid. I don't know how to explain that, but it's one of the reasons why I lived overseas for 5 years. I lived in Prague for 5 years, because nothing really makes you feel like a dummy than living overseas and listening to the people that have their level of erudition overseas is far more so than you will find, except for maybe Boston. I mean, because Boston is sort of the center of academia in the United States. All right, so what we're going to talk about today are logical fallacies that are used in discourse. And I'm just going to kind of list them off real fast. I've been blathering on about this other stuff already. People are tired of it, so let's get to the point. And for example, when I was going against a crazy ocasio-cortex, that's actually called an ad hominem attack. You're attacking the individual and or their intellect, or maybe where they're from, or their race, or whatever. None of that has to do with whether or not the individual's positions are right or wrong, whether or not they're correct, or if they're testably fallacious. All right. So if somebody says that there's a transgender, well, I'm sorry, there's no such thing as a transgender. XY means you're a guy. If you were born with a dick, you ain't a chick, and it's provably so. You have to understand that you have to look at evidence in a rational sense. You can't just calling yourself a goat doesn't make you a goat. All right, so we have to stop listening to people that clearly have the gender dysphoria, they're mentally ill, and we have to stop listening to this nonsense. All right, so I was using what's called an ad hominem attack against the crazy cortex. Because the pablum that comes out of her mouth, that she spews out of her mouth, is patently absurd, and it's provably so. I mean, it's provably absurd. So one of the things that I do when I talk to people in public is I have these little phrases, and one of them is a man comes to me in history and says, I think there's something called oxygen. I can't see it, touch it, taste it, feel it, or measure it, but I think it's out there. And I look at him and I say, well, you may be right, but until you have evidence to be able to support your position, verifiable, repeatable, testable, falsifiable evidence, I must reject your argument. And that's the way that we need to think about things in the world. Is until you have evidence to be able to support your position, we must, if we're going to think as a scientific materialist, we have to think and speak as though our decisions are based on fact. We may come to different decisions. Our conclusions may be different. All right, I've become very conservative. I used to be a Democrat. As I've hit my 50s and 60s, I've become very conservative. So we may come to different conclusions, but the foundation upon which that we derive our conclusions from need to be factual. We have to be mindful that we have to change our positions if we're afforded the opportunity with new information. We have to, in martial arts, we call it emptying our teacup. All right, so you have to be able to empty your teacup of the knowledge that we think we know and allow new information to come in to see whether or not we need to check our previous, because otherwise you end up with confirmation bias. We're out there trying to look for evidence to be able to support our preconceived ideas, and that's, the police do that all the time. They're always, oh, well, he must have done it because we don't have any other, which is also a logical fallacy. He must have done it, and so we don't have anybody else, and so we go looking for evidence to be able to support the position that this person is responsible for this particular crime, when in fact there could be a dozen other reasons going on why this individual that actually did commit the crime, and they're chasing down the wrong person. And the police end up spending up a lot of time trying to find the facts to be able to support their preconceived ideas, and the legitimate perpetrator actually gets away because time goes by and witnesses fade and so on. So then we have the straw man argument. This is where someone actually attacks a different subject rather than topic being discussed. So you're talking about a particular discussion. This is, and somebody raises another issue, and they're starting to try to take you off into we call it getting lost in the corn maze. Right? They start raising issues that are tangential, but they're not on point. All right. There's also what's called an appeal to ignorance. This argues that a proposition must be true because it has not been proven false, and there is no evidence against it. All right. So, for example, there's a God. Well, and someone says, well, God exists. Well, that's great, but there's no evidence to be able to support his position. And of course, coming from ignorance to say, well, there's no proof against him, so he must exist, which is patently absurd. And what this is it's not just about absurdity. It's logical fallacies. It says we have to look at actual, repeatable, verifiable, falsifiable, and testable evidence to be able to use to draw our conclusions from. Anything else other than that is intellectually disingenuous. All right. Then we have false dilemma, false dichotomy. Says presents limited options. We call that a bifurcation error of logic, where it says it must be this or this. It says, well, you're either for America or you love it or leave it. All right. So that's a classic example of a bifurcation error of logic, where they call a false dilemma or false dichotomy, where you're provided, there's two options. Well, that's a bifurcation error of logic, where there could be several. It says you can love America, but you don't want to leave America. You want to change it. Only the coward will leave. If what you want to do is you don't agree where the nation is headed, you have to start speaking out. When I start talking about that, it reminds me of the Sarah Bareilles song, "Brave." Let the words fall out. And that's what we need to do. Is we need to start speaking out against the nonsense of the libtard, woke-tard, legacy media, and all this other nonsense that's going on. I use the word nonsense because I can't use the language that I do in public. There's slippery slope. Assumes that a certain course of action will necessarily lead to a chain of future events. Well, that's among others that we would refer to that as assuming facts, not in evidence. So what someone's doing is they're assuming a slew of possibilities that may happen in the future, but there's no evidence to be able to support the position. So that's considered a slippery slope. Begging the question is the same thing as a circular argument, where a person's argument repeats they already assumed before without arriving at a new conclusion. So these, you can look these up, but we need to go through these because a lot of people don't know about logical fallacies. Computer programmers have to take sentential and predicate calculus, Boolean logic, modal logic. You have to take all these different kinds of logic that are required, and in that process, you end up taking you learn about logical fallacies in undergraduate. Because if you don't understand logic, you can't be a computer programmer, which sort of makes sense. And so you have to understand how all of that works, and then then it moves towards discourse. All right. So hasty generalizations is a claim based on a few examples rather than substantial proof. In a colloquial sense, everybody uses generalizations. All right. So I can sit down and say, well, the evidence that I've seen by looking at this is that in Islam, the average IQ is 81. All right, nothing. Sam Smith is about Sam. What's his name? I want to say Sam Smith, but that's not right. Anyway, he says that nothing has come out of Islam in 1,000 years. He's absolutely right about that. There's absolutely nothing. But if you were to go to some of the higher universities, you may find some very, very, very high IQ individuals that come out of Islam. But they, of course, are the statistical outliers. They're the exceptions to the rule, and they're on the far right side of the IQ spectrum. All right, so you can find high IQ individuals everywhere, and then you can find low IQ individuals everywhere, regardless of race, creed, color, religion, otherwise. These are aggregate, by definition, aggregate, general, sweeping statements, and that's the way we have to speak in the world. Otherwise, someone would have to be a Wikipedia and have all of these numbers memorized, and then in today's modern world, people would be sitting there looking this stuff up on Wikipedia articles or other, or I should say, authoritative sources to be able to see whether or not. And who's going to do that? Nobody's going to. In fact, that whole process of taking a reducto ad absurdum extreme to challenge every word that comes out of somebody's mouth is in itself actually a logical fallacy. Then there's what's called a red herring, is an argument that confuses or a distraction to shift attention away from a topic and toward a false conclusion. A red herring is a term that's also used in finance. It represents an S1 initial filing for an IPO. I don't know why they ever called it that. And then there's an appeal to hypocrisy. Focus on the hypocrisy of the opponent. It says it deflects criticism away from oneself by accusing the other person of the same problem. So it says it's in essence, well, you did it too. Well, the fact that somebody else did something has nothing to do with what you've done. You can't use that at trial. You're being accused of murder, and then you find out the prosecutor committed a murder. Well, that's nice, but that's a completely separate issue. It has nothing to do with what's going on with your previous actions. There's what are called casual fallacies. Now, fallacies fall into these causation. It's called causation. There's proximate cause and cause and fact, for example. Cause and fact is what you actually did. or what actually happened, and then there's approximate causes, which you can prove at trial. And so causation causes lots of problems. That moves towards ad hoc ergo propter hoc, where I brought an umbrella, I put my umbrella up, and it started raining. And so, the logical fallacy is that if I put an umbrella up, it's going to start raining. All right. It says, because of this happened. Okay. Ergo hoc. It's a post hoc ergo propter hoc. It's a logical fallacy. In fact, that's the next one in the list. It actually translates as after this, therefore because of this. This type of false cause occurs when someone mistakenly assumes that because the first event preceded the second event, it means the first event caused the later one. All right? So sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. All right? So you can't just assume that because this happened first, that the second event there was causation to the first event. Say there's the sunk cost fallacy. Is when someone continues doing something because of the effort they already put into it. So, for example, Tesla is a good example. The investors in Tesla have plowed billions and billions of dollars into electric cars, and I'm sure Mr. Musk, who's actually extremely bright, unlike Biden, he's the richest man in the world, but it's legit. I mean, the guy's he's top of the food chain smart. But the decision, you have really smart people make really bad decisions, and it happens all the time. The idea that these electric cars are going to go anywhere, the auto-driving cars, the man doesn't have a law degree. He needs to go talk to some lawyers. So you get this Tesla driving down the street by itself. A kid darts out between two cars, and the Tesla kills the kid because it doesn't have the ability to be able to stop in time, just like a human wouldn't be able to stop in time with something like that. Who do you sue? Well, do you sue Tesla? Do you sue the guy? Do you sue the individual who's responsible for the application that actually sent the car out there? Who's responsible for the death of the child? I mean, you got to have somebody to be able to sue. So if Tesla's going to, what you think Tesla's going to sit down and say, oh yeah, we're going to pay all wrongful death claims because our technology kills people? It's absurd. Anyway, so there we go. They got sunk costs. They've got investment in time and energy, advertising and so on, and they are not going to want to stop doing what they're doing because of sunk costs, and that is in fact a logical fallacy, where what they should be doing is, like I said before, is that they need to be working on putting liquid fluoride thorium reactors around the country, create substantially free electricity. If people don't know about that, there's a professor up at CU Boulder that's written a book on this. It's yellow cover. I'll find it. I'll put a link down below so that you want to go buy this book because it explains what's going on in the energy industry and how we can have cheap electricity throughout the entire country, safe, cheap electricity throughout the entire country. And the idiots at the Department of Energy, they won't do it because why? Sunk costs. You got people out there that are financially involved in the infrastructure and all this energy infrastructure, and they don't want to come up off of it because, of course, they've already spent the money. It's already built, and it's a power base. It's a fiefdom that they're able to control, and they don't want anybody else coming in trying to muscle in on their territory. Whereas then, if you had the cheap electricity, then you'd be able to produce the hydrogen for the hydrogen fuel cells, and then you would be able to have a reasonable, long-term, renewable source that's reliable, and but they won't listen to common sense. That's people in Congress, low IQ. Then there's a equivocation, which happens when a word or phrase or a sentence is used deliberately to confuse, deceive, or mislead. That happens all the time because you don't understand how they're using the word. When Clinton says, I did not have unlawful sex, well, he's a trained attorney. He knows what he's saying. He says, I did not have sex with that woman. Well, how do you define sex? Well, there you go. That's equivocation. All right. So there's what this says appeal to pity, but we call it appeal to emotion. With respect to do you love your dog? Well, I do love my dog, or in this case, my cat. And so if somebody makes an argument with respect to love, for example, well, how could you do that? Don't you love me? Well, that's an appeal to emotion. It doesn't have anything to do with factual basis to draw conclusions from. Then there's the bandwagon fallacy. Now, the bandwagon fallacy is exactly why so many people are still walking around with these stupid little masks on their faces. Because if everybody else is doing it, it must be right. All right. Then, of course, it creates the appeal to authority, which is, some like the dumb like Fauci says that you need to wear a mask. and then it'll help. Yeah, well, this is ridiculous. A virus is so small that it'll pass through a mask like a dust through a chain link fence. The idea that a mask does anything to prevent the spread of viral and bacterial infection is absurd. There's absolutely no studies to be able to support it. Historically, no one has ever done it before. Now, when we're talking about the Black Plague, they walked around with masks on, but these people didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't realize that it was a flea that was causing the problem. You know, they used to put, during the plague, they put these masks on, these cone masks on, and they were full of herbs, thinking that it was good, it would clean the air, and it would filter the air, and it would keep them from getting sick. Well, what do you have? You have people that don't have any scientific understanding of the world, and they're doing the best they can with what they think they know to be able to prevent from dying from the bubonic plague, when in fact it were the fleas, because the stupid Catholic Church, because, you know, the Catholic Church didn't like cats. They didn't have the cats because they killed off all the cats. Cats didn't kill the rats, and the rats carried the plague. So there you go. Appeal to force. Yeah, every time you try to threaten somebody, that clearly is a fallacy. There's a genetic fallacy. I touched on that earlier, where the fallacy claims that an idea, product, or person must be untrustworthy because of racial, geographic, or ethnic origins, which is absurd. Who cares where somebody is? Who cares what color their skin is? This is it has nothing to do with anything. Now this says appeal to tradition, but we refer to it as an argumentum antiquatum. Antiquatum, in other words, it must be right because it's old. We've been doing it for 25 years. There's a hearsay exception in the rules of evidence, Rule 803, where if a document is more than 25 years old, no foundation needs to be. Somebody's diary. You get a diary from the 1970s, right? It admitted as evidence. You don't have to have any foundation for that document. It's presumed to be valid because it's old. Well, that's a logical fallacy on its face. It could be completely fabricated. We don't know, because you don't have anybody able to testify to a legal certainty as to the contents of the document, that it's legitimate, and then there's nobody there to necessarily be able to cross-examine. They just allow an old document to be admitted because it's more than 25 years old. Well, that's a logical fallacy, and that's actually an exception to the hearsay rule, which is absurd. All right, and then the reverse of that is argumentum ad novum. It must be right because it's new. Like these idiot kids running around talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, transgenders, the snowflake generation. They think they're right because they're young and they're hip, and old guys like me with long beards says we're a bunch of old geezers and we don't know what it's like to be young in a modern world. Well, that's true. I mean, we certainly, when I was growing up, we didn't have to worry about, gangs in the neighborhood I grew up in. They would have probably been beaten down to death with baseball bats. You come to my high school with that attitude. Those the kids that were the cowboy types, they would have taken those people out into the what's called smokers' wall and beaten them to death with baseball bats. We don't put up with that nonsense bullshit. All right. It says argument from personal incredulity. It says asserting that opponent's argument must be false because you personally don't understand it or can't follow its technicalities. Well, there you go. I mean, that's an awful lot. If you start talking, you can't speak rationally to somebody who has a closed mind. Somebody who supports Biden, especially now since gasoline is $5 a gallon, says these idiot Democrats that think that the Democrat path and Biden's administration is even remotely competent. They're delusional, and you would never be able to explain anything to them. It's not even worth having a conversation with them. There's a relevant conclusion. The fallacy occurs when an argument purporting to establish a particular conclusion then directs to prove a different conclusion. Yeah, well, what you're doing is that you're saying, cats. I happen to love my cats, but we'll say my cat is evil because everybody that's ever owned a cat knows all cats are evil. If they were bigger, they'd eat us. All right, but the allele frequencies of house cats. Could you imagine a house cat with allele frequencies with respect to diversion, with the same with a dog? So you could have a small house cat, and you could have a house cat the size of a Great Dane. I mean, the thing would eat you. So we love our cats, but all cats are evil. So you say all cats are evil, therefore all dogs must be evil. Which is, once again, it's a logical fallacy. A non sequitur is any argument that does not follow from the previous statements. That previous one was a non sequitur, if you didn't catch that. I caught it just as I said it. Contradictory premises, establishing a premise in such a way that it contradicts another. earlier premise. For example, if God can do anything, he can make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it. All right, so that's a contradictory premise. Right? So that right there is a logical fallacy. Stacking the deck. Stacking the deck is where, and people do, prosecutors, defense counsel, co-counsels. When you go to trial, you have prosecution and defense. It's civil. It's the same in criminal, but it's so you got your civil cases. You have a prosecutor. You have defense attorneys. Someone's prosecuting the case, and then you have defense attorney for the respondent in the case, defendant in the case. And what they'll do is they'll get their witnesses up on the stand, and then they get the questions are so framed so that the witness only talks about those elements that support their position. Now, in criminal law, there's what's called my brain is farting. If I don't think about it, I'll think about it. But what happens is that how can I not remember this? Anyways, what will happen is the prosecutor will call a cop up. And by the way, this is part of where I'm headed is that a police officer says anything can say will be used against you in court of law. What happens is that a police officer is only allowed to testify at trial for those items that can be used to convict you. He is not. It's considered hearsay otherwise. All right, and there we go. It's called an admission by a party opponent. All right, so even if the officer knows of information that would exonerate you from the crime as an admission by a party opponent, he's not allowed to testify to it. Right, it's considered hearsay. It says if there's somebody else, if there's something else that's going on, you got to call your own witness to be able to lay foundation for your defense. It's not the prosecutor's job to provide you your defense. So even if a cop has evidence to be able to support the position that you aren't the person that should be charged, he's not allowed to talk about that. He can only testify to that information that he knows of truthfully, because they can be held for perjury. They're not allowed to lie. If they get caught in a lie and they're perjuring, well, they're in trouble. They're allowed to lie to you on the street, but they're not allowed to lie during trial. All right? Prosecutors can lie all the time. They're held harmless for lying flat out, but it's an ethics violation. The multi-state it's the rules, the professional rules, the MPRE, multi-state professional rules and ethics, prevent them from doing it. Although there's no statute that prevents them from doing it, they can be disbarred for it. But so there we go. So that's an admission by party opponent, and police officers can only testify to that which they know can convict you. They cannot exonerate you. They're not allowed to testify to it. All right. Then there's what's called nirvana fallacy. In other words, an idea is discounted, or solution is discounted because it's not a perfect solution to the problem. Right. When you take differential equations, when you take algebra, I should say, when you take algebra and basic calculus, single variable calculus, you find that there's for every where there's functions. All right, the battery died. Then I had to move the camera to be able to put the new battery in. I just got to get around to getting a power supply. All right, so we're talking about family solutions, and so and the way Bollinger Bands work with respect to risk, and Brownian motion used as a driver, as we say, a driver into quantitative models to be able to calculate risk. And we have upper and lower boundaries of risk, and those are called Bollinger Bands. And you'll learn all this stuff when you go to take an MBA in finance. But so life isn't about black and white. It's very difficult sometimes to be able to find solutions. That's why the Laffer curve is so counterintuitive. The more the federal government lowers income tax, the more revenue the government makes. Now think about it. It's actually intuitively intelligent, because if the federal government were to increase income tax to 100%, nobody would have any money and the government wouldn't make anything. Right? So the more you lower taxes, the more revenue you have. But you can't get the dumb Democrats to figure this out. The first thing Trump did was he started lowering tax rates, and it started generating like crazy amounts of revenue, and the economy just boomed. It doesn't take a genius to figure this out. You lower taxes, people have more money, spendable income goes up, GDP goes up, more consumption. But when you have $5 going into the pump for every gallon of gas that you're buying, says nobody wants to go anywhere, nobody wants to do anything. There's fear in the marketplace. Nobody wants to borrow money. Certainly people can't afford to buy homes anymore. One of the biggest mistakes that we've made is that the reason why people are talking about communism, socialism, and all this other nonsense is because we've had nothing but a slew of low IQ presidents. Well, once again, I'm going to do other videos with respect to the next worst president is Roosevelt. All right, the last time was Wilson was bad, and then Roosevelt's New Deal. It was horrible decisions by Roosevelt. Man was low IQ, uneducated. I mean, he's made president of the United States, and that's a pattern. This is the presidencies have not been. We haven't had an intelligent president other than maybe Kennedy and Trump. Trump is very smart, but he's a businessman. He's not a lawyer, and he has to put up with these crooks in New York. This Tammany Hall thought process that you get in New York, and then it's probably just as bad, if not worse, in Washington D.C. because you've got a bunch of retards, and it's our fault. It's like I said yesterday. It says if you want to look for the guilty, you need only look into a mirror, because you people are the ones who vote these fools into office. You need to give these people an IQ test, because I guarantee you they're not above 105, 110. If you actually start asking them direct questions and getting direct answers, well, they'll fail instantaneously. I'd like to see any one of these have a YouTube video where they can actually, like with Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan needs to run for president. Joe Rogan is a smart guy. He's got a broad and deep education in a lot of different fields, and more importantly, when you watch his podcast, says he shuts up. He lets his people talk. His guests get to come in and be able to speak their piece, and he asks intelligent questions. And he knows when he doesn't know what he's talking about. He asks questions to be able to clarify something that he doesn't understand. I mean, Joe Rogan should be running for president, because you wouldn't vote for me. No, I look like a derelict. You wouldn't vote for me. But you'll put some moron like George Bush into office. Obama, very articulate. But what did he do? He did nothing. He was a first-term senator, came out of nowhere. It's just absurd. Out of a boom, the guy had never achieved anything. He went into the White House poor, and he comes out rich. And I don't remember who said it. I should look this up. This is, but if you leave public office wealthier than when you left, and then when you went in, you're a crook. I don't remember who said that, but it's a good quote. All right, cherry picking once again. Cherry picking is substantially the same thing as just getting your witness, for example, to testify to only those things that can be used to support your position, and ignoring everything else. That's the same as card stacking and so on. Says one that's very similar to that is called nut picking. Says where an individual uses cases or data that falsify a particular position while ignoring related cases or data that may support the position. So that's just the reverse of cherry picking, where it's nut picking, and you're only looking for something to be able to falsify their position, and not entertaining the evidence to be able to actually support their position. Once again, that's the logical fallacy. There's survivorship bias. It's a small number of successes of a given process are actively promoted while completely ignoring a large number of failures, like COVID, right? I want to say that I don't think that they've actually isolated COVID, because there's what's called Koch's imperative, where they actually extract a virus or bacteria out of you and give it to somebody who doesn't have it, and then wait for their symptomology to be the same. Then they extract it and they compare the two, right? And I don't think that they've actually done that with the COVID-19 virus. I don't think they've actually isolated it with particularity. But I'm not a biologist. It's not what I do. I don't know anything about medicine, so I really can't speak to any until I do my research on it. And even then, I probably wouldn't understand it because of the vernacular that these biochemists and these medical doctors use. It's not something that I do. There's gambler's fallacy. Just because you spin the roulette wheel and it comes a white 10 times in a row. I guess it's red black. It comes up red 10 times in a row. Well, the next time is going to be red. Well, that's simply not true. That moves towards that's martingale in his random walk, where previous events do not add up, and you end up with like this. So each event is all by itself, and then each event is by itself. And then and the other one is like a sum-accumulation, a running total. A magical thinking. Now, I don't know if this will work with the camera here. And sorry about this. I should have thought about this in hand, but I don't know if you can see it from where you're at. But it's called magical thinking. Back when I was a kid, I was 8 years old. I was a little Cub Scout. And you get these little arrows, and you see you have to do so many little projects to get each little silver arrow, some little gold arrows, and then when you're like a third grader, you're a Cub Scout, and then there's like a wolf, bear, and lion or something. I don't remember. It's a long time ago. And to be able to earn one of my little badges, you had to do something that was drama based, right? And so for 10 cents, you could buy a little Boy Scout magic book, right? So what happens is that I learned some tricks, whatever it was. And I got quite a response from it. And I was a geeky kid, big ears. I walked like a duck. So I wasn't athletic. And so doing the magic kind of set me apart, and I kind of stuck with it through high school. And then I went to some reunions, and people asked me about it. And so I've gone back to some of this. And I'm assuming that some of this, so just because an individual thinks that they know what's going on in this world, that doesn't mean that they do. All right. So what happens is that, all right, I don't know if that came out of the camera or not. I'll edit it, maybe have to put it in. But even if you think you know how it works, that doesn't mean that you know how it works, right? So the world isn't as straightforward as it first appears, right? So what happens is that when people sit down and look at this stuff, I don't know if you can see it here, right? There we go, look at that. I don't know if that come out because I can't see the angles on the camera. I should flip the little screen around. But that's magical thinking. That because the coin has disappeared, magically has disappeared, says then it must be that there's magic involved. Believing in God is magical thinking. Metaphysics is magical thinking. You pick up a stone and you hold it to your head and something good happens. Prayer, magical thinking. These people are delusional, and they need to be told they're delusional. But the problem is that what do we got? Bandwagon. It's cultural. You go over to the Middle East and everybody's Ma'ala. It's all about Muhammad, right? Omye Reho is the Buddhism, and so on. If you change Jesus Christ's name to Egbert, in Egbert's name we pray, Amen. It would expose the nonsense of a lot of it. But people don't listen. They believe what they believe, and there's so many people who do believe in this nonsense, and it's cultural. Once again, you're raised with it as a kid, and I'll tell you from personal experience, the ability to be able to walk away from that indoctrination and inculcation of religion is a very difficult thing to do. To be able to say to yourself that you were fool enough to allow yourself to be buffaloed into believing something so patently absurd as young Earth creationism, which is what I was raised with. The Earth is what, 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and God created man, and how many Chinese were on Noah's Ark? Well, there weren't any Chinese on Noah's Ark. Thank you very much. And so the next question begs is, where from do we get the Chinese that we have today? Oh, look, they would have had to have evolved. Why? Well, because homology shows that you can't get a new race by the mixture of two races, right? So, I mean, it's absurd. You got Aboriginal Australians, you got Native Americans, you've got, you've got the blacks, you got the Asians, the Orientals, and so on. So, and these are genetically differentiated races, and that you can't just create a race. It takes 40,000 years to be able to get speciation like that. Well, it's not really speciation, it's raciation, I guess you could call it. Here's one I didn't know about, never heard of it before, and I went and looked these up earlier today in preparation of this video. And I know most of these, of course, but every once in a while you get caught off guard. There's appeal to the stone, which I've never heard of before. It's dismissing a claim as absurd without demonstrating proof for its absurdity. So I refer to something as absurd, and that apparently constitutes as a logical fallacy because I'm dismissing a claim as absurd without demonstrating the proof for its absurdity. You see that? Yeah, so we have to be careful about that. Appeal to authority, of course. Everybody looks to the dum-dum Fauci, or somebody in authority to be able to make decisions for them. Old people in particular. They go to the doctor all the time for every little thing because that's their ideas. These are their authoritarian personality traits. They look to the dum-dum Biden presidency or the Pope. Excuse me. To further a thought process, because what are they doing? They're appealing to authority, which of course is ridiculous. And that is in itself, it's a logical fallacy. Here's another one I didn't know about. The courtier's reply. A criticism is dismissed by claiming that the critic lacks sufficient knowledge, credentials, or training to credibly comment on the subject matter. Well, so there you go. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a guy named Styx Hexenhammer 666. I watch Styx all the time. Styx is far more highly educated in the internal politics and all of the individual bills and so on that are going on. This is, so Styx is more highly educated in that field of study than I am, right? But he's not a PhD from Harvard, law school, and doesn't teach, political theory. So does that mean that he has to say doesn't have any validity? Of course not. It's ridiculous, right? So there you go. It says you can't use what's called the courtier's reply by dismissing a claim because somebody lacks what you appear to be credentials. There's what's called credentialism. The idea that somebody has to go to college to be able to get a degree, to be competent within a field of study is absolutely absurd. Law is a good example of that. Anybody with any real acumen could sit down with law books and teach themselves the law, especially nowadays with access to the internet. Now trial court procedure and some of the other stuff that you actually physically have to be able to do, because we have what we call blinders. What happens is that when you go into court your first time, even if you've taken moot court as a course of study, well, it's extracurricular, and you walk in like this, it's almost as though everything that you've thought you've known oozes right out of your left ear, and you get the blinders on. And everybody experiences that the first couple of times you go to trial. And those kinds of things you have to be able to handle. Your courtroom procedure, there's a certain way that things have to be done. You got to learn how not to interrupt, because there used to be court reporters. Now everything is being recorded, it's called the FTR device, the for the record recording systems, the little clock up front. And you have to let everybody have their individual say, because otherwise when they go to transcribe for appellate purposes, the transcriber can't pick out who's saying what. So that's a very difficult thing to learn how to. When someone's patently lying, you instinctively want to just jump up and start screaming at them. Wait a minute! Another dead battery. I'm gonna get a power cord for this. I don't have to deal with this anymore. And I'm almost finished. There's appeal to ridicule, which is where you're mocking or stating that the opponent's position is laughable to deflect from the merits of the opponent's argument. All right. So you can't just say that's ridiculous and point and laugh at them, because their position very well may be correct. This is judgmental language, using insulting or pejorative language in an argument, which of course doesn't really move towards an argument at all. But I mean, in a context when somebody is just coming with like transgender, supporting the transgender nonsense, there's no evidence to be able to support the claim that there's any such thing as a transgender. You can whack a guy's dick off, give him hormones to grow tits, and he's still a goddamn genetic male. And if he wants to put on a dress and call himself a female, knock yourself out. Go on with your bad self. But you shouldn't be allowed to compete against women. Real genetic women. This is ridiculous. And cat starts meowing. And the other one I get all the time is when people say, well, I'm entitled to my opinion. Well, that's a logical fallacy. You're not entitled to your opinion if your opinion is based on nonsense. Right? And there's chronological snobbery, which is that the idea is deemed incorrect because it was commonly held when something else known to be false was also commonly held. So what they're saying here is that back in history, people believed in spirits, and because they believed in ghosts and whatever, the devil and this other nonsense, that everything else that came out from that era also may not be correct. It's because of this must not be true also, error. And that's also, it's called chronological snobbery. So in essence you're saying that it's old, people didn't understand science at the time, and so all of their other accomplishments are to be discounted, which of course simply isn't true. So this will turn into probably a 45-minute video, but there we go. I'll edit it down as much as I can, and there we go. Thanks for the time.